What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 competitive budget decks for the November 2017 format. This is a really big deal because now that the format is slowly starting to unravel and define itself, we can take some educated guesses of how the format is ultimately going to shape up and see what options are available for if you love playing this game competitively but don't want to break the bank. Now, before we get into it, I did want to mention that I know a lot of you guys are really interested in purchasing this shirt, and I am now officially selling them on my website. So check out the link in the description below if you're interested in purchasing it. I just shipped a large quantity of these earlier this morning, so they are selling fast. So be sure you don't miss out. But getting back into the competitive budget decks, let's take a look at the meta before we discuss the decks in depth, because SPYRAL so far is having the highest representation, and then we've also have a little bit of diversity in comparison to the older format, because we have stuff like Pendulum Magician, and we have Trickstar, and we have Paleo and True Draco, and all these other decks that seem to actually have a little bit of a chance compared to the old format where SPYRAL were just absolutely dominating everything, and that's thanks to in part to the November 2017 ban list. But we can pretty much make the assumption that SPYRAL is still going to be the best deck, and that's kind of what we're going to be looking after here. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of these other viable competitive decks that are doing very well can actually be played on a budget if you relinquish some of the certain aspects. Now, hand traps are one of the biggest things this format, especially in stopping SPYRAL, and they can be really expensive, but the decks we're going to be talking about today are very good decks, and even though hand traps will bolster their ability, especially in the SPYRAL matchup, all the decks I'm going to be discussing today can be built for under $100, and that's counting both main and extra deck. One other thing I did want to discuss is that evenly matched is a big problem, especially when it comes to budget decks, but it's really a problem for every deck if you think about it, and it pretty much comes down to what decks and how those decks can pretty much handle evenly matched, because some decks handle evenly matched better than others. A lot of people are experimenting with a card like Solemn Scolding to help counteract evenly matched, and also because it's very applicable in a lot of other situations outside of just solely stopping evenly matched, but that's a little bit outside of our budget. A good option here might be something like Artifact Lancia for your side deck. The card is only a few pennies, and it stops evenly matched, which ultimately means you won't be blown out by some of the other players that might have some more money to spend on copies of this card. So keep that in mind when you're deciding what deck you want to play, because evenly matched is something you're going to see, especially on the regional and YCS level of events. But starting off with number 5, we have Barrier Statue. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Oh, here's Cimoooooooo goes again talking about barrier statues, but consider this. So SPYRAL is considered the best deck of the format, and the win condition for SPYRAL is to get 2 monsters on the field and ultimately summon a SPYRAL double helix. Well, if you have a barrier statue out on the field, your opponent's not going to be able to get to that double helix because that is a special summon, and ultimately that thwarts a majority of their plans, because that's kind of how the deck functions. If you deny the deck's ability to go into the extra deck, they're really left with like a bunch of SPYRAL monsters that really don't do a whole lot. And not to mention, the barrier statues can also lock down SPYRAL Super Agent's ability to special summon itself from hand, meaning they won't get an additional summon, but also won't be popping any of your back row as a barrier statue player, because you are playing a very protect the castle style deck where you just slap down your barrier statue or your fossil dyna, set 5 back row, and proceed to ruin your opponent's day. Now, the biggest drawback to playing barrier statue is that it's a little bit of a one-trick pony and a little bit luck reliant, because if you're not going first, this deck is not going to be good at going second whatsoever. I mean, if you're summoning a barrier statue into your opponent's SPYRAL Sleeper plus Firewall plus Trigate, like it's just not gonna fucking happen. But if you go first, you actually have a chance and have the opportunity to not only cheese that win, but you can also go first again in game 3 if you happen to lose game 2, and you actually have a chance to take the match as a whole. I wouldn't recommend it as a highly viable strategy, because compared to something like back in Zodiac format where pretty much everyone was playing Zoo, so it was very viable because you had the opportunity to lock down most of your matchups, there are some decks in this meta that can play around barrier statues rather easily. True Draco is still very prevalent, and since that deck doesn't rely on special summoning in the slightest, that's going to be a difficult matchup for you as well. So combine the fact that decks can play around it, and it's really only a going first deck. It's an okay option, but it wouldn't be my highest recommendation, but something that's very cheap nonetheless. Now moving on to number 4, we have ABC, and I really like ABC here because thanks in part to the release of the Cyberse Link structure deck, cards like Cosmic Cyclone and Dimensional Barrier are cheaper than they've ever been in the past, and I think that's really good, especially considering that cards like that are strong against one of the strongest contenders for this coming format, and that's Pendulum Magician. Those cards can just completely shut down a Pendulum Magician player's plays and just ultimately swing a game back in your favor. Now, I really like ABC for a couple reasons. First off, it's incredibly cheap. I mean, the extra deck's pretty much what you're looking at in terms of the most expensive component here, because you can play stuff like Destrudo and Dragon's Ravine, which gives you access to Ancient Fairy Dragon, which is a little bit on the higher end of things, but overall, ABC kind of plays like a very old traditional style Yu-Gi-Oh deck, where you have your normal summon, you don't special summon too much, and you've got a really good solid boss monster, which then does a lot of unfair things, and quite frankly, ending on a board of Decode Talker, ABC Dragon Buster is still very difficult for a lot of decks to deal with, and if you play the deck right and you kind of learn the ins and outs of the deck, it can actually be very well suited for this format. One other thing as well that a lot of people don't realize is that ABC is very capable of playing a lot of different floodgates. ABC can easily play stuff like Anti-Spell Fragrance, as well as Skill Drain, which Skill Drain is one of the most punishing floodgates of this format, because if you flip Skill Drain up against a SPYRAL player, they're basically fucked. Like, they are not going to out that card, and they have no way of really removing it, and you're pretty much going to just be in the driver's seat from that point on. So, especially considering everything triggers in the graveyard, and not only can you use Buster's just, both of his effects to not only destroy one of your opponent's cards, and then detach so that the effect still resolves while under Skill Drain, you've got a lot of really cool tricks up your sleeve if you decide to play ABC. Now moving on to number 3, I've got Paleozoic. Paleozoic is just one of those decks that's always going to be around, whether it's a meta contender or a dark horse. But again, thanks in part to the Dimensional Barrier reprint, this deck is even now more affordable than ever for anyone looking to play it. I think one of the best things I like about Paleozoic is that it's a really good deck whether you go first or second. Now, again, if you're going second against SPYRAL, you're gonna have a little bit of a rough time because SPYRAL Sleeper makes the deck, you know, it's really difficult to play through a SPYRAL Sleeper for any deck, but for Paleozoic especially, because you're immediately losing 2 cards at the end of your turn, and potentially 2 more cards at the start of your opponent's next turn. And if you're starting on 6 cards, you know, if you only set 5, that's not really going to do you a whole lot of good. But very similarly to ABC, and as well as Barrier Statue, Paleozoic can play a lot of floodgates. You can play stuff like Anti-Spell Fragrance. You can play Mistake, which Mistake is an incredibly good floodgate, very similarly to Droll and Lockbird, which a lot of people are using as a hand trap. And since Paleozoic doesn't need to search so much, that's a really good benefit that the deck can run. And in addition to that, Paleozoic benefits from playing floodgates more than any other deck, because not only are you getting the added value of the floodgate itself, but you get the advantage back from special summoning one of your Paleozoics. Keep in mind that Totally Awesome is still an incredibly powerful card, and it's just cheaper than it's ever been at the current moment. Paleozoic is a very good dark horse deck, and also a very good budget option for anyone looking to play it. Now moving on to number 2, I've got Pendulum Magician. Now Pendulum Magician is one of the best decks of the format. Obviously SPYRAL is up there, but I still think Pendulum Magician isn't too far behind. It got 2 of the top 16 at the past ARG, and I think as we look at more regional results as they come in moving forward in the future, we're going to be seeing a lot more Pendulum Magician. Now, one advantage of Pendulum Magician, especially from a budget perspective, is the fact that Pendulum Magician doesn't really benefit from playing lots of hand traps. Sure, hand traps are very plentiful and powerful this format, but you have to realize that because Pendulum Magician is inherently a combo-based deck, and you want to play as many combo pieces as possible so that you can establish an incredibly powerful board, it hinders the deck's ability to combo off if you're polluting the deck with all of these different hand traps. So a lower hand trap count is actually a good thing when it comes to a deck like Pendulum Magician. And again, I know hand traps are expensive, but if you're willing to spend the money, you could get a set of Ghost Ogres, which Ghost Ogre is pretty formidable in this format. It may not be the best like something like Droll and Lockbird, Ash Blossom, or anything else, but it's still a good hand trap and something you should definitely consider. I really like Pendulum Magician because the deck is so inexpensive thanks due in part to Pendulum Evolution. The deck is incredibly consistent. Time Pendulum Graph is an absolutely beast of a piece of removal, and also not to mention, the deck can go into Bagooska more consistently than probably any other deck in the current format, and Bagooska is an absolute nightmare for any deck to deal with. That can just completely shut out your opponent's plays, especially if they're playing Spiral, and that's a card that no one wants to be on the receiving end of. So that's why I think Pendulum Magician is a very good budget option, and something you should really consider and learn up on, not only if you want to play it from a budget perspective, but even if you want to spend the extra money and just go all out and get all the necessary pieces you might want to consider playing that deck moving forward. Now, moving on to number 1. A lot of you might be thinking, well, if Pendulum Magician isn't in the top spot, what is? And the deck that I picked is actually going to be Burning Abyss. Now, let me explain. The biggest thing I like about Burning Abyss moving forward as a budget deck this format is, aside from the fact the deck is extremely inexpensive as a whole, you have a deck that plays very well around hand traps. Everyone is going to be main decking such a wide variety of hand traps just to stop Spiral from going off. But one of the biggest advantages that Burning Abyss has as a deck is that all of the hand traps outside, I would say, of Ghost Reaper don't really do a whole lot to Burning Abyss as a whole. Droll and Lockbird has almost no effect on the deck. Ghost Ogre and Ash Blossom have a very marginal effect. And then Max C is pretty much bad for any deck, so we can pretty much come to that conclusion. And Ghost Reaper is only good if they have the Dante in their extra deck, which I would say, unless you're going into game 2 or 3, your game 1 is actually probably pretty safe, unless your opponent is anticipating a lot of Burning Abyss, or they just don't want to deal with Burning Abyss at all. The deck is super cheap. You can pick up all the components of it, like I said, easily for under $100. I mean, you've just got a super consistent deck here. You've got cards that float, and you've got a deck that can really go into the grind game, which actually poses a very big threat to a lot of different decks. I mentioned earlier how Spiral Sleeper is a very big problem in this format, and solving how to deal with that is one of the key components to approaching this format, and Burning Abyss actually deals with it rather well, because since all their monsters float, your opponent's not going to really want to pot them with Sleeper because they're just not really going to be netting any advantage off of that. You can also run stuff like, again, going back to the Floodgates, Anti-Spell Fragrance, that's a very viable option, and Skill Drain, again, can easily be played in Burning Abyss since the deck is so reliant on effects triggering in the graveyard that you can just have yourself one hell of a time. Also, not to mention that with this support coming in the Link Vrains pack, might be a deck you want to consider investing in, and that's why I had to put it as my number 1 pick. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think are your top 5 picks for budget options moving forward into the November 2017 format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you really found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.